good afternoon everyone, and thank you for joining this lesson again. So as I said last week I sent through the paper that we're busy working on, and as I said last week, this week we're going to focus on the essay question, at least one of the two essay questions, okay? And for this one, since we did the Black Consciousness Movement essay during the winter school program, today we're going to focus on the question 4, which is the coming of democracy, the road to democracy essay. Okay, so we're going to look at, just like we did last week, doing an overview of the content that you would have covered in class or are busy covering in class with your teachers, and then I'm going to refer to the structural PowerPoint that I used for the winter school program to just go over the structure of the essay, so we can look at how we are going to formulate that essay and put it all together. Okay, so this is the question that we're going to be dealing with. We're going to be looking at, so South Africa's first democratic election in 1994 was lucid, clear evidence that ultimately negotiations were triumphant, okay, victorious over conflict and violence. Critically comment on the statement by referring to the period 1990 to 1994. So we're going to go over the evidence that we're going to need in order to unpack this particular topic that we're going to be looking at. Okay, so let me just open that up. Okay, so we're going to be looking at how South Africa emerged as a democracy from the crisis of the 1990s. And just like you learned in class with your teachers, the period after the 1980s, from the time Nelson Mandela is released, was not necessarily a peaceful period. It wasn't Mandela's released from prison and suddenly everybody's happy and everybody gets along and boom, we have a democracy, okay? It was a really tumultuous period. There was a lot happening. There was a lot of fighting that was happening. There was a lot of violence, and that violence was escalating, okay? And so between the period 1990 and 1994, there were a lot of events, many events, and many people who tried to actually derail that process of negotiations. They didn't want a democratic South Africa, okay? And so what we look at is how that transition from that state of apartheid to democracy, how that was managed by all the people and all the parties involved. Okay, so there were various events that led up to the negotiations. It wasn't something that happened overnight. They didn't just like pick up a phone one day and say, okay, let's talk, okay? Apartheid needs to end now and let's just get this over with, okay? There were various events that actually led up to that period. So by the 1980s, South Africa was sinking into a spiral of political violence and economic crisis, okay? There were sanctions against South Africa, economic sanctions against South Africa. There were boycotts that were happening. It was a really difficult time, okay? And all that insurrection had made large parts of South Africa ungovernable. There were many negative outcomes, including the disruption of black schools, civil conflict, there were detentions, police violence, and the economic instability. One of the biggest factors that led to the breakdown of apartheid. There were also tensions between the two sides of the struggle, okay? So white people had been indoctrinated to believe that democracy would mean a communist black government, and we know what communism was like at this time, and that would take everything they own and destroy their culture and their way of life, and that military power was the only thing that protected them from this. On the other side of the scale, black people didn't trust the regime, and they feared that any talks would lead to a sham settlement, and little real change to the apartheid system. Okay. So in 1985, P.W. Botha offered to release Mandela on the condition that the ANC withdrew violence as a form of struggle. Okay? Now, we must think about how difficult a decision this would be for the ANC, considering that they were armed because they were being attacked. So Mandela responded by saying that no talks could take place until the government policies, okay, which he and the ANC considered as obstacles had been cleared, and that there was trust between them, that a genuine solution could be found. Okay, so they kind of had a little bit of a stalemate over there. Okay, so in Paulsmoor Prison, okay, the Emergency Act of 1986 then prompted Mandela to request a meeting with the government, and as a result of this, there were several secret meetings arranged between Mandela and the Minister of Justice that you see over there, Kobe Kutsia. Okay, so Mandela had made the sole decision to enter into this process of negotiations. He didn't involve his prison colleagues in it, or those ANC leaders in exile in Lusaka. So you can imagine there were some people who were feeling very, very left out of this decision, and not quite sure what this would entail, because this was Mandela going off on his own, okay? And when he was questioned about that, okay, about not involving his other colleagues in prison, about not involving the ANC leaders who were in exile in Lusaka, he said, there are times when a leader must move out ahead of the flock, go off in a new direction, confident that he is leading his people the right way. He took a step in faith and in trust that that was the right step. Okay? Because it was going to be very difficult if one party had to take that first step. And so Mandela took that first step on behalf of the ANC, on behalf of oppressed people in South Africa. So the secret talks with the ANC in exile, that happened between 1987 and 1988. So in July 87, the group of 60 liberal Afrikaner businessmen and cultural leaders met the exiled ANC leadership for a week in Dakar, Senegal. And some of the critical issues that they discussed were the armed struggle, the ANC's alliance with the Communist Party, the goal of majority rule, and the idea of racial conciliation. So there were about 20 such meetings after 1987, and most of them were held secretly in hotel rooms in foreign cities. And these were not negotiations, no deals were struck, instead the different sides were getting to know and understand each other and build a climate of mutual trust. So these talks were the talks before the talks about the talks. It gets pretty confusing, okay? So it was Nelson Mandela's meetings with the NP at Paulsmoor that was making headway in the end of apartheid. That by May of 1988, Mandela had met P.W. Botha's chief strategist, Niels Barnard, and between 88 and 1990, they had actually met up 47 times. So they developed quite the relationship. In 1989, Mandela was then given an open telephone line to consult with Oliver Tambo, the ANC president at that time, who was in exile in Lusaka, and later on he was actually allowed to meet the UDF leaders at Victor Verster prison where he was being held. And in 1989, Mandela finally met with P.W. Botha himself. So, the secret talks with the ANC in exile continued. So between 88 and 1990, there were large delegations, so up to 20 influential leaders on both sides met at a country estate in the UK called Mel's Park House, and that to discuss the conditions that would be put in place for proper negotiations. But many leaders on both sides were still opposed to the idea of talks. Militant ANC leaders like Mac Maharaj and Chris Hani were preparing for a new series of MK attacks against whites. And the white political leaders and the police continued to hold on to exclusive power with even more brutal repression of people who were resisting against the apartheid regime. Okay. So 1989 to 91 is where we are now, and that's the time when they were preparing the way for negotiations. Okay. So during 1989, there was a lot of talking and a lot of relationship building that was happening, but there was very little sign of breakthrough. So a number of important events in 1988 and 1989 made a new approach possible. So in 1988, the South African army then suffered the major military defeat in Angola, the Battle of Cuta-Cuneval. There were more economic sanctions in the 1980s, coupled with the international pressure, which resulted in international banks disinvesting from South Africa. And P.W. Botha had a stroke in 1989, and he was succeeded by F.W. de Klerk. So this shook the military establishment. So the first point, okay, with the SA Army, all right. That particular defeat, it shook the military establishment. And it enabled the Liberals in the National Party to argue more strongly that whites couldn't hold on to power by force alone. Because you could see that the army could be beaten. For the second point, the economic sanctions, so by the time de Klerk became president, the foreign companies had already lost confidence in the South African economy, and they'd already started withdrawing their money. So the economy, as we know, was in very deep trouble, especially when considering the already severe economic sanctions against South Africa. And then with regard to P.W. Botha's stroke, okay, so in 1989, de Klerk was then elected leader of the NP due to Botha's failing health. Now, de Klerk might seem liberal, but he was a very conservative thinker. But he realized that because of everything else that was happening, the only way forward was to reform the system. Okay? It was the only way to preserve some sort of white power. So there had to be preparation on both sides for what was to come. Okay? So when we look at what was done by leaders to prepare white people for the negotiation process, so de Klerk believed that the NP and its black allies, like Dr. Buthelezi of the IFP, could negotiate a constitution that would preserve white power and even challenge the ANC in elections. Why was that? It was because the IFP wanted independence and self-governance, okay, which was the total aim of the apartheid system anyway. But white people were increasingly divided, okay? Democrats, liberals who believed and wanted a democratic South Africa, where all races included in governing the country and interests of all preserved, against the conservatives, so that including the Conservative Party, who wanted apartheid to continue, and the AWB were driving a paramilitary movement against